As we begin today, let us begin first of all with a short prayer. Father, we praise you, we thank you, particularly for the fact that there seems to be a period of the virus slowing down in many places of the United States today. Help us to see an end to this situation, inspire those who are looking for ways to fight it. We ask this in the name of Jesus the Lord. Amen. So, we're going to the year 1500. From the very beginning of the 16th century, there was a massive growth in Europe. Remember, we had the plague, and now the population's beginning to come back. Farming was recovering, and land was being reclaimed. See, the farming was abandoned because so many of the peasants were dead. And farming was recovering, trade was increasing, banking was flourishing. The world was returning to what it had been before, and everything seemed to be going on fine except the church. The church, as we noticed earlier, was very much in need of reform, and we talked about very powerful individuals who came up and were very important individuals in all kinds of things, and who wanted reform in the church and worked for reform, but it simply wasn't happening. Now, there were many attempts at reform, and they were unsuccessful. And lay people at this time were becoming more and more vocal and strong in their call for reform. Reform, oftentimes, they would even elect a pope who was interested in reform, and then the curia, the people around him, would frustrate all his efforts at reform. It was just a very, very strange thing. The things that they were most interested in, there was terrible financial dishonesty in the church, where people would get an office and even sell off church lands and things like that in order to personally enrich themselves. There was the promotion of a superstitious trust in relics and legends. The idea of trusting in legends are stories about apparitions of the Virgin Mary and stuff like that. A lot of this stuff was made up. One of the interesting things today when we talk about Fatima in Portugal or Lourdes in France or these different places, they're very well documented today. I mean, they're films even, but they're very well documented. And so we don't have this, but at this time they would make a fictitious story about some apparition somewhere where Mary told them to collect money and this sort of thing, but it was just a terrible thing. And relics became very, very prominent. It's interesting, when I was in the seminary, we're talking 1959, when I entered the seminary, a friend of mine, a very wealthy friend, was going to Rome, and he asked me what he could bring me back. And I asked for a relic of James the Apostle. Relics were very, very prominent at that time, very, very important. And they seem to have gone into kind of an eclipse in our own day anyway. This problem grew as the people of Europe became better educated. So as people became educated, they would notice the difficulty in some of the things were being said. Scholars from all the universities were warning of a coming disaster if something were not done about the reform of the church. So we have people at the lay level who are screaming for reform. We have scholars who can read the signs of the times and say, you're either going to reform or blow up. And then the people at the top who are enjoying the benefits of this sort of thing are not the least interested in the reform. It'll come as no surprise to you that this is the point where we begin the study of the Protestant Reformation. So it is important to remember a couple of people that we've studied earlier, because while they preceded the Reformation by 100 years, they actually laid the foundations, and they are the true beginning of the Reformation. The first was the English theologian Wycliffe. Wycliffe was the one who translated the Bible into English initially and did a lot of work in Scripture, a great preacher, very influential individual. But his basic teaching was that the Bible itself was the sole rule of faith. Now, that might not sound like a big deal and this sort of thing, but the fact of the matter is, if you want to get rid of the authority of the Pope, the first thing you have to do is find another authority. Like, for instance, if you have a great authority, like the Pope, and that's all you do is get rid of it, then everything disintegrates. You have to have another authority. So what he did was establish the Bible as the authority. And he said it was the sole rule of faith. And once the authority of the Pope, there was an alternative authority to the Pope, then all you had to do was somehow destroy the Pope's authority. And that's what the Reformation will do. The second was Huss. If you remember, he was in Bohemia, the Czech Republic today. And on the basis of Wycliffe's teachings, he established the independence of each congregation. So, like, for instance, if the sole rule of faith is the Bible, and we're a gathering of 50 people, our interpretation of the Bible should govern us. And this group over here, where it has maybe 50 people, they have the Bible to govern them. They don't need us to govern them. We don't need them to govern us. We each have the Pope. So it destroyed this hierarchical structure. The hierarchical structure went away. It was unnecessary because the Bible was the rule. He is rightly regarded as the beginning, incidentally, of the Baptist tradition. If we look at a particular Protestant group that flows from him, it is the Baptists. In 1517, an Augustinian friar by the name of Martin Luther became a priest. And the instance of his becoming a priest is that he was out in a field one day when a terrible storm began, and he took shelter under a tree and was watching the lightning and all this sort of thing. And what he did was make a promise to St. Anne that if he survived the storm without being killed, what he would do was become a priest. And so that's what he did. He would survive the storm. He had a very wealthy father, and his father provided Martin with an excellent education, one of the very best of the day. And in Martin's life, Martin, very well-educated man, had a great difficulty in overcoming sin. And sin was sort of a constant part of his life. And he was a very scrupulous man. So, like, for instance, a lot of things that you would and I would regard as a temptation. You see a beautiful woman and you're immediately attracted to her, that's a temptation. What you do about it has to do with sin. And Luther would see sin everywhere. And he just saw himself, he could not get away from it. And he saw sin was very much a part of being human. And if you talk about temptation, that is a part of being human. Sin is not temptation. But if every temptation is a sin, you simply cannot escape sin. So Luther became convinced that it was impossible to live in this situation. And he had this great inspiration that it is by salvation, by faith alone, and has very little to do with good works. Now, Luther will not adopt what we will ultimately see in Calvin, which is predestination. But what Luther does is enter into this idea that the key thing, you must believe you're saved. If you believe that Jesus saves you, then that is salvation, the faith in Jesus. And good works can follow, but good works aren't the issue. The issue is this faith. And his teachings were immensely popular. And the reason why his teachings were so popular, first of all, he's speaking about an experience that we all have. In fact, I'm sure you're familiar with that quotation from St. Paul, where St. Paul says, the good I want to do, I find myself not doing. The evil I want to avoid, I find myself doing. That's a common experience. And so it was enforced by the text. And I should add one thing here, too. I've studied a lot about Luther. I'm very interested in him as a person. And I would say that Luther is probably the finest scholar on Pauline theology who ever walked the face of the earth. But when I began to read through Luther's commentaries on the scriptures, I noticed that while his Pauline theology was magnificent, every other book of the Bible that he wrote commentaries on were all basically copies of St. Augustine's commentaries. I don't think Luther had much of a knowledge of the rest of the Bible. And one of the key things to understanding a biblical concept, it's easy to come out of Paul thinking that only faith matters and that nothing else really does. But it's also easy to come out of the Epistle of James thinking good works matter. It doesn't matter what you believe. And we will notice in the debates with Luther, the man who represented the Catholic Church was a man by the name of Tetzel. And we won't go through much of him in the text. But Tetzel consistently quotes James. Faith without works is worthless. And Luther consistently quotes Paul. Salvation is by faith. When Luther does his translation of the Bible into German, he will add a word to the text. And where it says salvation is by faith, he will add the word alone. It is salvation by faith alone. And Luther, certainly, that's the way he thought. And I think that's probably the meaning of the biblical text. The important thing is faith. And so the influence of Luther's teaching was spread by his students. He was a university professor, as will almost all the Reformation leaders be. And his influence spread very wide through his students. Everything came to a head when the Pope began the campaign to build St. Peter's Basilica. It began a collection throughout the entire world to raise funds for the building of that building. And any of you who've been to Rome will know that is the building we're talking about, the building that's there in Rome today. And you can well understand that money was not in anyone's checkbook account at that time. So it was a huge, huge process. The particular point in the fund that rankled Luther was the selling of indulgences. Now, the true teaching about indulgences was that they were a way of explaining the relationship between good works and merit. Like we know that we know it's a good work to go to Mass. We know it's a good work to say the Rosary. We know it's a good work to give money to help the poor. We know I would give 100 good works. But now, which is the most important? How do they rank up? Well, if you begin to look at indulgences, indulgences rank good works. So that if you look at indulgences, you can tell how important the church thinks a particular work is. But as you can imagine, let's take a simple thing like giving money to the poor. Giving money to the poor is a good work. Now, how do we see, is it a better work if you give more money? Not necessarily. Is it a better work if you give all that you have? Not necessarily. You may have obligations to meet with regard to children and stuff. So how do we determine? Well, you realize that's a very, very slippery slope. And that's exactly what the church went on. And what it ended up was the more money you give to the church, the more you can ensure your salvation, until it reached a point where there were certain amounts you could give, you could guarantee salvation. Didn't matter how you lived. And it was being preached that way. In response to the preaching of the indulgences in Germany, Luther composed his famous 95 theses or statements and nailed them to the door of the church in Wittenberg, which is where the university was. The university was in Wittenberg. So he nailed the statements. And I want you to know that the nailing of the statements to the door is not in the least an unusual thing at that time. If you were a university professor and you had some theory you wanted to teach, you would put it in a thesis, nail it to the door of the church, and invite anyone who wanted to debate it with you. And you just write all that on the thing, and the two of you would show up, or if anyone wanted to debate it, they would show up, and you would debate it at a set time in front of the people. I think you know that if you do a thesis, like when I did my theses for the licentiate in Canada, I did my thesis on the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. And the thesis point that I made was there are visible, discernible, and documentable physical effects of the anointing of the sick. And I went through a lot of things from different angles of where that was and everything. But anyway, when I presented the theses, I had to present it to 5 people who were heads of departments at the university. And these 5 people all read the theses, and then I had to present it to them and defend it against their questions. And that's basically what would go on this way. So anyway, Luther nailed up his statements. The theses were in Latin. And I should mention that not a single one of them dealt with the idea of salvation by faith alone. They were aimed at the many abuses in the church at that time, and most particularly to the selling of indulgences. He was aiming at how rich the Pope was, how rich people in the church were, while they were calling everyone to give money to the poor and all this. Just all the regular abuses, the things you would go on with. And so these were posted. They were in Latin, but while they were in Latin, they were very quickly translated into German. And the reaction of the people was way beyond what either the church or Luther were prepared for. One of the things you notice at this time, now Luther is a university professor. University professors do not tend to be revolutionaries. In fact, if you study revolution in history, you'll notice there's a person with an idea, and they're a scholar usually. Their idea will be picked up by someone, and they will start the revolution, and it'll go on. So like Karl Marx wrote the book that brought about communism, but it was Nikolai Lenin who was able to bring it about, to bring it to a revolution and stuff like that. And what happened is the movement went beyond both Luther and the Pope. Now, the dispute between Luther and the Pope became very harsh and unfair on both sides. I like sometimes to use as an illustration when I'm talking in a sermon about what can happen. But I set up the model where a mother will come into a child's room and say, would you please clean up the room? And the child's response is, you're always telling me what to do. And the mother's response is, you never do anything you're told. And you see, each of them have taken impossible positions. But rather than arguing the initial thing, should I clean my room, which is the initial question, rather than arguing that, we go through a whole list of things, and each one they move further away from one another. And that's what was going on. So finally, Luther was excommunicated. During this period, though, Luther published many books, and he attacked traditional beliefs. He attacked belief in the nature of priesthood as being, coming from God and select. Luther saw priesthood coming a lot more from the election of a congregation as who they wanted as a priest, onto the reality of the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. He publicly burned the Edict of Excommunication, and his teachings spread through Germany like wildfire. And there was a reaction. People would take over churches, monasteries, and convents, and they would expel anyone who didn't follow the teachings of Luther and install people in those institutions who did. Common people were particularly attracted by the use of German in Bible translations. It's very interesting to me. At the time that the Mass was translated into English, and we could use English the vernacular in the Mass, that there were a group of people who reacted against it and were vehement about it, and there are a group of people who loved it and were vehement about it. No one was ever that divided about the Latin, but once the English came in, there's just this huge division that persists to this day, so that they even allow Masses in Latin now. The nobles were attracted by the opportunity to take over church lands, and they also wanted to be free of the taxes that the church laid on them for the building of St. Peter's. The church in Rome had been given the right under some of the concordants to tax the nobility in different areas. Germany was one of them. And so this gave them the freedom from sending that money to Rome, and also allowed them to take over church lands. So they were delighted with it. Then a very interesting thing happened, and this event is probably the most important one from my perspective with regards to Luther. In 1525, the German peasants in Germany, they began a revolt against the royalty of Germany. And they revolted because of the principle that Luther had used to free himself from the Pope. See, the Pope maintained he had this divine authority. And Luther maintained, well, if you're living in this terrible, sinful, immoral life, and no one would deny the Pope was, if you're living that kind of a life and your authority comes from God, you're obviously separated from God and have no authority. Now remember, I told you that Wycliffe established the Bible as an authority, but you had to have a reason to destroy the authority of the Pope before you could move to the other authority. And the immoral life of the Pope provided that. So Luther said that. However, over a period of time, Swiss peasants had won a lot of their freedom, so the Germans decided to do it as well. And they had good reason to attack their nobles, who were living lives very similar to the Pope. They looked to Luther for some kind of support. So they were breaking from the nobles for the same reason Luther had broken with the Pope. But he was completely opposed to political unrest, and he supported the royalty. When the peasants began to act violently, Luther urged the royalty to crush the revolt violently. It was one of the most terrible things that took place historically. And this led to two striking effects. Luther at this time lost much of the support that he'd enjoyed among common people because he sided with the nobility against them. But he also lost many of the nobility who had backed him because they saw his teachings as being a foundation for destroying their authority. And so many of them turned back to the church, many of the German peasants turned out. However, at this point we can say the Reformation is off and running. What I would say about my personal evaluation of Luther, I want you to know this is a personal opinion, but I see there's a certain amount of hypocrisy in the fact that he accepted the immorality of the Pope as his excuse to do away with his authority, but he would not accept the immorality of the kings as an excuse for the peasants to overthrow them. I think you either have to say that the separation from God and the immorality frees you from anyone's authority, or you have to say it does not free you from authority. And I should mention, biblically, Jesus says it does not. And where he says it does not, he's speaking to the apostles at one time, and he says, you must listen to and obey the Pharisees because they sit on the seat of Moses, the authority had passed down, but do not live the way they're living. Okay, so he didn't destroy their authority. And I guess if I were to put it in Roman Catholic theology, I'll use it as an example. If I were a 15-year-old boy and my father were to ask me to carry some drugs that he had sold to someone, I do not have to follow that command from my father because it is immoral. But it doesn't destroy my father's authority. The same father could in the next breath ask me to empty the trash. I would have to do it. So we believe that authority that gives an immoral command no one needs to follow the immoral command. But that doesn't destroy the authority of the person. Okay? So the next person we're going to deal with is a Spanish military captain, 1521. Ignatius of Loyola spent several months recovering from a wound. He loved reading romantic novels with tales of knights and ladies. And when he had read all the books in the hospital, he was in for a while, the only thing left there was a life of Christ. So he led this life of Christ and a collection of the lives of the saints. And one of the things he noticed, and this will be part of St. Ignatius' theory on the discernment of spirits, St. Ignatius noticed that when he read a book about the knights and the ladies, and when it was over, it was over. He enjoyed it, he loved it, it was great. But when the book was over, it was over. That's all there was to it. But when he read the life of Jesus, he felt just as good as he did when he was reading the lives of these knights and ladies. But once he finished that, he found that the good feeling about the book remained, and he felt really good about it. And I would use an example in my own life. I think you know I do very little reading, because of the dyslexia. But one of the things that fascinated me was Harry Potter, so I listened to it on tape. And when I was listening to Harry Potter on tape, I would listen to it only in my car when I had to drive different places to do things. But I really looked forward to driving because I was anxious to hear the whole tape, and I really loved the whole tape. But once it was over, it was over. And yet if I read a book like Teilhard de Chardin, who talks about our relationship with nature and stuff, I find out that every time I see a tree or anything, I'm thinking in terms of that book. It stays with me, and it's something very, very good. And so that's the discernment of spirits. So St. Ignatius would say, there's nothing wrong with the novel you like the Harry Potter, nothing wrong with it. But that's all it is, it's a recreation. And there's something very powerful about the other book that inspires you in such a way that it stays with you. So he noticed that when he read the novels of the saints, that the feeling stayed with him. He was most impressed with 3 saints, Francis, Dominic, and Catherine of Siena. And if we remember, they are 3 people who were very, very powerful in reform. Every one of them was powerful in reform. He put down his soldier outfit when he got out of the hospital. He made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and returning to Spain, he began to study to be a priest. During those studies, he wrote his most famous book, The Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius. Today, it's the foundation for any program of personal reform. Once you have studied the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, you can see in it Alcoholics Anonymous, Drugs Anonymous, Sex Anonymous. All these programs for personal reform that are built on these things rather than drugs or stuff you take, all these things that are built all come out of Ignatius's spiritual exercises. It's a powerful, powerful book. I'd encourage everyone to read it. Finishing his studies at the University of Paris, Ignatius and 6 of his companions vowed that they would spend their entire lives working for the salvation of the whole world. Ignatius became a priest. He and his companions presented themselves personally to the Pope in Rome to assist him in any way that he might want. They became the Society of Jesus, or what we call the Jesuits, and the unusual thing about the Jesuits is a 4th vow they take. They take poverty, chastity, obedience, like all religious orders. The 4th vow they take is a promise to personally have absolute obedience to the Pope. They were unique in that. As this was going on, Luther was preparing a final attack on the Pope, claiming that the papacy in Rome was founded by the devil and that the Pope himself was the Antichrist. As Luther was nearing the end of his life, this would be his very last attack on the church. Now, I want you to know that Ignatius was not opposed to Luther. I don't think Ignatius knew much about Luther. Many Catholic theologians were really interested in the types of abuses that Luther was attacking without ever leaving the church in any sense. So they would see him well that way. But the particular thing of Ignatius was his strong and powerful support of the Pope. And this particular thing about the Pope being the Antichrist put Luther and Ignatius on opposite sides of the fence. Okay? One aspect of the whole business of the Reformation that I think is very seldom noticed, and I've alluded to it several times, I think it's the most important point, is the complete lack of education among Catholic clergy. If you wanted to be a priest, let's say in the mission here, I would go to the pastor of the mission, and if he thought it was all right, he would have me work with him as a server, setting up things in the church at work around the mission, volunteer, whatever, paid over a period of time. And when he thought I was ready to be ordained, he would tell the bishop. And if the bishop agreed, the bishop would ordain me. I'd come back as a priest here. So many priests had no education at all, except the pastor of the parish where they were. But they didn't have a great theological education. Now, when we were studying education, we noticed that at times education was only open to priests, and that they were among the highest educated in every field, but most were not educated at all. And the educated ones largely went into universities, like we talked about Copernicus, you know? We talk about these great names in history and science and stuff. They're all priests, and because education was available to priests. But parish priests oftentimes did not avail themselves of that, okay? At the same time, almost all of the Protestant reformers were in fact university professors. And the parish priests were in no way prepared to defend the theological position of the church against the reformers. In fact, one of the things I noticed at the time that I was ordained was that many priests and parishes were not prepared to defend attacks against Catholic theology by people who based their attacks on the Bible. They did not. I may have told you this story, but we had a priest retreat maybe 3-4 years ago, study days. And in the study days, the professor was a moral theologian, I think from Camarillo, the seminary down there. And he was discussing different points, but he was talking about the care of the poor. And he says, now where do we know the church's concept of care of the poor, and which is our social justice? And people raised their hands, and in general, they said, we know it from the prophets in the Old Testament that talk about the care of the poor, which is true. And we know it from Luke. Luke's gospel is very much social justice. And there's a lot of it in Paul as well. And so they were doing these things. And he says, no. He says, I'm looking for something much more recent. None of them could do it. I raised my hand. I said, Rerum Novarum, which was an encyclical by Leo XIII. And he said, yes. And then we began to talk about the idea of the importance of Scripture. And again, they talked about different things, but no one could give him anything recent. I told him De Fino Afflante Spiritu, which was an encyclical by Pius XII about reading the Bible. And once we were all finished, it suddenly occurred to me, there was no one in that room who was educated before Vatican II, except me. And when I was educated, when we went through studying these, the proofs they gave us for things were papal letters. Because, you know, we have the infallibility of the Pope. Well, the Pope's infallible, and he says this, that establishes the truth. Well, that's well and good for a Catholic. That is no good for a non-Catholic who's thinking to enter the church has taught about the thing of the Bible. Now in the seminaries, everyone is taught the biblical basis for these things, but that wasn't true at the time. And I'm talking about when I entered the seminary, not the 1500s. It was at least the 1800s by the time I entered. So anyway, the Jesuits changed all of that. They were highly educated. And one of the really interesting things, if you were to take a map of Europe and you were to draw the Jesuit houses across Europe and draw a line through those, you would separate Catholic from Protestant Germany. And I'll give you another example of that line. When Germany was divided in the last war, after the last war, it is Protestant Germany was Communist Germany. And the other areas that the British, the French, the Americans had that were eventually united to be West Germany, those were all the Catholic areas in Germany. Okay? But that line was really established by Jesuit houses. The main response to the Protestant revolt in the Catholic Church was the great move to reform. And I'm sure you've gotten this view from me as I go on. I do not believe anything that happens historically is ultimately negative. And if you watch it, it will all work for the benefit of the church. There's a Julian of Norwich, and one of her sayings she used all the time, I use it as well. In fact, you might write this down during the Corona thing. But anyway, Julia said, "All will be well. In very many ways, all will be well." And I believe that's true. When you and I are living through a period in history, like for instance, I lived through the whole pedophilia thing in the Catholic Church. That was not a pleasant experience, and I will not see the full results of that in my lifetime. But it will change the Catholic clergy for the better. It ultimately will. The Reformation be a horrible thing to live through, but when it's finished, it brings about a different church. I've often said this. When I look at the popes in my lifetime, there have been several I have really liked. John the 23rd and the present pope, I think are just fantastic. There have been a couple I really disliked. But in that period, there hasn't been a single one of them who isn't a saint. You can't deny their holiness. You can talk about their theology, talk about the things they're doing. No one can deny their holiness. And all of that's a result of the Reformation. So, we go on. As a result of the Reformation, it was now recognized within the Catholic Church at every level that reform was necessary. Many new groups began to form. Some were gatherings of reform-minded Catholics in very small communities. These were reform offshoots from many of the orders. So we watch many orders go through a reform. The orders had gotten lax over a period of time, so they'll go through the reforms. And that's why you'll find conventual Franciscans and the Franciscans that we call the Friars Minor. There are a whole bunch of Franciscan orders, a whole bunch of these Dominican orders. And we watch reforms come, the attempt to reform different things. The Franciscans gave birth to the Capuchins. One of the most important moves was the foundation of the Ursulines for the education of women, maintaining that mothers are the ones who pass on the faith and they should be educated. Now, see, originally education was confined to the priests, clerics really, and then it began to be largely confined to men, and now can't think of her name now, the parish in Pacific Grove is named after her. But anyway, she founded a group called the Ursulines. And what she did, she wanted permission from the Pope for the sisters to go out and work in the community, particularly for the education of women. At this point, all women's orders had to be in a monastery. That's why St. Clare, who wanted to start a community exactly like St. Francis, had to establish a monastery of poor Clares. They did not go out. But anyway, this woman, her name was Angela McCrory. Angela McCrory got permission. She went to visit the Pope for a private audience, and the Pope was pretty strong on the fact that you can't actually have a community of women out in the world because they aren't safe. And Angela's argument was very clear. She says, the faith is passed on to children by their mothers. If you do not allow the education of women, you will not allow the passage of the faith in that way. And she was very clear, because at this time with the Reform, they are most interested in dealing with the arguments. So you have to be educated to deal with that. So she was allowed to found this argument, this order. And this order is the first of the kinds of orders that all of us were used to, the nuns who taught Catholic school when I was a child. The women did not live in a monastery. They went out in the community to work and particularly to educate. Realizing the need to respond to Protestant reformers, the leaders of the church finally fostered and encouraged the many reform movements in the church. Again, the leaders in the church were not willing to foster the reform as they came up, these different movements, because they knew they would eventually get to the idea of reforming the papacy. And so that they didn't want, so they were stopping it. Now they realized reform was necessary or the whole thing was going under. So they began to work on this. In 1519, Charles V becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. In his person, he united Spain, southern Italy, the Netherlands, Holland, Belgium, Habsburg, Austria, and the Spanish lands in America. Now imagine that. That's a massive area he established it. He was very well educated in the humanistic strain, and he was deeply Roman Catholic. He was, however, tolerant of the Protestant movement. This, I think, is a product of the humanistic education. When you talk about humanism, we begin to be tolerant of ideas that we don't agree with, okay? When you begin to study law, one of the ways you study law is to draw a point on the board, 2 points, and you begin to draw circles around them. And circles are the rights that each individual has. And where you make laws are where the circles intersect. So when my right to shoot a gun conflicts with my right to point it at you, because if I point it at you, I've destroyed your right to have a gun. So then we have to do a law to correct that. Well, that's humanistic. And so as long as the Protestants maintain their Protestant stuff, the Catholics maintained their Catholic stuff and weren't burning down one another's churches and everything, he was fine. In 1523, Clement VII became Pope. And as a member of the Medici family, he was extremely well educated and very strongly humanistic. However, he was a very timid person and did not respond to efforts of Charles to reform the church and call a church council. Charles wanted to have a council called in order to deal with these difficulties because he believed that the Protestants would recognize a council as over the Pope, so that they might not hold the Pope, but a council represents the church. And so Charles tried to do this. Clement, remember now we're in the building of St. Peter's, Clement was very interested in art. There's a lot of wonderful pieces of art in St. Peter's Basilica, but as a humanist, his humanistic ideas did not turn so much to looking at ideas, but his humanistic thing turned on the thing of art. Remember, that's a big part of the humanistic movement too. So Charles and Clement met in the city of Bologna, but the Pope was afraid of Charles' power and refused the idea of a council. He thought that if there was a council, Charles's power would rule over the council, and Charles would end up more important than the Pope. Charles called a diet, or it's like a council, of his empire to settle the arguments, and in the mind of Charles to bring everything to union and communion within the church. He thought he could find a way to bring the Protestants into the church, into the Catholic Church, and still retain their same ideas. Now we'll watch this happen, like for instance, much later now, there's going to be a great growth of the Catholic Church in Eastern Europe. Much of Eastern Europe at that time was Orthodox. So what do you do with this? Well, a beautiful accommodation was worked out where these groups were invited to accept the authority of the Pope, and the Pope accepted the fact that they celebrate the liturgy very differently than we do. They use leavened bread, not unleavened bread, and in the different languages, and so much so that you look at something like the Ukrainian church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, the hierarchy and everything came under the authority of the Pope, and we have Ukrainian Catholic cardinals and stuff like that. But their liturgy and everything is completely the liturgy they had. So their customs and everything they were allowed to retain. And so when the church wants to do this, when both sides want to get something together, there are ways to do it. And so it happened there. But the papal delegate ran the meeting very skillfully. And the Protestant theologian, Melanchthon, was also very conciliatory. Melanchthon was Lutheran, one of the greatest Lutheran theologians, but he was, I would say, more Catholic than most of the other Protestant theologians. And but anyway, he wanted to reconcile, and the Catholic delegate wanted to reconcile. But finally, there was no agreement. So the Diet, and now we're just talking about the empire. So the Diet of Worms, which it was called, it took place in the city of Worms. It condemned the Protestants and remained in force. So it was a disaster. Now both the emperor and the Protestants appealed to the Pope for a council. It's interesting here, the Protestants are appealing for the council as well as the emperor. Again, the Pope refused. And I think this was the last thing that would have prevented the Protestant revolt. Very soon, military and political actions against the Turks. Remember, the Turks were still slowly expanding towards Western Europe. That took Charles away, and the Protestants were allowed to live in peace. Okay? So, we'll go through a number of the reformers now. There was a man by the name of Zwingli, and Zwingli was a priest. He had a very strongly humanistic education, and he was at work preaching the Protestant position in Zurich, Switzerland. Now remember, the Protestant position at this time was held by many Catholic priests. Okay, so while Luther had been condemned, certain teachings condemned, there hadn't been this strict break, these are Protestants, these are Catholics. It's just Catholics who practiced in different ways. Okay? His teachings, much like those of Luther, moved slowly further and further away from the church until finally he reached the point he wanted to end celibacy for priests, fasting, and the veneration of images. Okay? So I think we know there are many priests today who are against celibacy. I can name some against fasting, and for many, the praying in front of images is not a thing, okay? So these, as theological positions, are not too big a deal, okay? However, in 1522, he got married. That changes it, okay? So he got married, and his canton declared their independence from Rome. Switzerland is divided into cantons. They're much like states, except much smaller. You know how small the country is. And in time, his brand of Protestantism would evolve into the teachings of Calvin, who in many ways is probably the most important Protestant theologian in history. So why don't we stop it there, and we will move on to go through more of the reformers and how Protestant theology evolves next time. Thank you very much.